Some houses keep secrets. Mine came with the invoice. The smell of damp cedar and lake water drifted through the open front door as I turned the heavy brass key for the very first time. After 6 months of inspections, paperwork, and negotiations, the forgotten mansion on Blackwater Lake was finally mine. The hinges groaned with a sound that echoed through the empty foyer like the house had been holding its breath for decades. Dust floated through thin beams of afternoon sunlight pouring across cracked hardwood floors, and somewhere deeper inside, an old grandfather clock gave a single hollow click even though it hadn't worked in years. I smiled anyway. Places like this didn't scare me. They fascinated me. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and restoring forgotten properties isn't just how I make a living. It's how I remember my father. He spent 30 years surveying land across the Midwest, and he drilled one lesson into my head before I was old enough to drive. Land never lies. Paper never forgets. That sentence had made me millions over the years because while everyone else chased shiny new developments, I chased history. Old deeds, forgotten plats, dusty county records, hidden easements. Every abandoned property told a story if you knew where to look. This mansion had been empty for almost 20 years. Most buyers walked away after hearing the rumors. Haunted, cursed, endless legal disputes, strange owners disappearing without explanation. I ignored every one of those stories because rumors don't show up in courthouse records. Facts do. The estate sale closed at barely half of market value, and I knew something didn't add up. As I carried my toolbox across the porch, I noticed fresh tire tracks cutting through the gravel driveway. They hadn't been there an hour earlier. A white luxury SUV rolled slowly toward the house and stopped beside the front steps. The engine fell silent. The driver's door opened with deliberate confidence. A sharply dressed woman in her mid-50s stepped out carrying a thick leather binder tucked neatly beneath one arm. Her smile looked polished enough for a political campaign, but never reached her eyes. "Mr. Caldwell," she asked. Before I could introduce myself, "Congratulations on your purchase." I thanked her, assuming she was another neighbor curious about the old mansion finally having an owner again. Instead, she extended the binder toward me. It landed in my hands with surprising weight, nearly 2 inches thick. I opened the cover. The first page carried an official-looking statement printed in bold black letters. Outstanding Homeowners Association assessments. Balance due, $483,612.41. I actually laughed because I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Then I saw the line beneath the total. Original assessment date, July 1974. My smile disappeared. "There has to be an error," I said quietly. She folded her hands as calmly as someone discussing tomorrow's weather. "No error, Mr. Caldwell. Every unpaid assessment, every accumulated fee, every penalty attached to this property transfers to the current owner." I kept turning pages. Decades of invoices, interest calculations, penalties, legal notices. Some documents were older than I was. Then one detail stopped me cold. The original owner's name printed across the earliest invoice belonged to a man who had died more than 30 years ago. I looked back up at her. She simply smiled again. "Welcome to Blackwater Lake," she said. "You've inherited 50 years of debt." I stood alone in that silent foyer long after the woman drove away, the leather binder still resting in my hands like it weighed far more than paper should. The faint smell of mildew mixed with old varnish filled the air while gentle waves tapped against the weathered dock behind the house in a slow, steady rhythm. Every restoration project has a moment when instinct whispers that something is not right. This was mine. Most people would have called an attorney before sunset. Some would have walked away entirely. I didn't either. Instead, I carried the binder into the dining room, brushed decades of dust from an antique oak table, and began reading every page from beginning to end. My father used to tell me that panic makes people skip details, and details are where the truth hides. That lesson paid. My mortgage more times than I could count. Growing up, I spent summer vacations riding beside him in his old pickup truck as he surveyed farms, timber lots, and forgotten family estates across 3 states. While other kids learned baseball statistics, I learned how to read boundary markers hidden beneath weeds, identify original iron pins buried under tree roots, and recognize when a property map had been altered years after it was recorded. Dad never trusted assumptions. He trusted measurements, signatures, and dates. Those habits became part of me long before I realized they would become my career. Restoring historic homes was never about flipping real estate for easy money. Every building deserved someone willing to understand its past before changing its future. That was exactly why I bought this mansion. The price had been unusually low for nearly 12 acres of lakefront property with over 600 feet of shoreline. Investors saw collapsing roofs, broken windows, and outdated wiring. I saw handcrafted stonework, century-old white oak beams, and construction techniques that no builder could afford to duplicate today. More importantly, I saw records that did not match the local gossip. Everyone in town seemed eager to repeat the same stories. The place was cursed. Every owner lost money. Nobody stayed longer than a few years. Yet none of those stories explained why a property this valuable remained untouched while luxury homes surrounded nearly every other section of Blackwater Lake. Rumors are convenient. Documents are expensive to ignore. As afternoon sunlight stretched across the dusty floorboards, I noticed something else. Every invoice inside that binder looked surprisingly clean considering some were supposedly more than 50 years old. The paper had yellowed naturally, but the ink remained unusually sharp. Several signatures looked almost identical despite being separated by decades. Even stranger, the mailing addresses changed repeatedly while the formatting never did. It felt less like a collection of historical records and more like someone had recreated history to appear consistent. Then I reached the final page. Tucked behind the invoices sat a freshly printed notice warning that failure to pay within 30 days could result in additional legal action against the property. The date on that page was only 3 days old. They had prepared the demand before I ever unlocked the front door. I slowly closed the binder and looked through the cracked dining room window toward the calm water shimmering beyond the overgrown backyard. Whoever had been waiting for me to buy this mansion had not been interested in welcoming a new neighbor. They had been waiting for someone willing to inherit a story that was never supposed to be questioned. The next morning, the mansion woke before I did. The steady cry of gulls drifted across Blackwater Lake, and the cool scent of wet stone floated through broken window frames as sunlight crept across the dusty floor. I had barely poured my first cup of coffee from a camping kettle when another vehicle rolled slowly up the long gravel driveway. Then another. By 8 o'clock, 3 different trucks sat outside my gate. The first belonged to the electrician I had hired to inspect the aging wiring. The second carried roofers. The third delivered a local tree service scheduled to clear decades of overgrown brush. None of them stayed longer than 5 minutes. One after another, they walked back toward me wearing the same uncomfortable expression. The electrician rubbed the back of his neck before handing me my deposit. "I am sorry, Mr. Caldwell. We cannot take this project." I asked why. He hesitated for several seconds before quietly answering. "The Homeowners Association advised us there is an active property dispute. They said any contractor working here could become involved in pending litigation." Before I could respond, the roofing foreman climbed into his truck and offered almost the exact same explanation. By the time the tree crew left, I realized this was not a coincidence. Someone had contacted every contractor before they even unloaded a single tool. Around noon, I decided it was time to introduce myself properly. The Homeowners Association office sat inside a beautifully restored stone building overlooking the marina, complete with flower beds trimmed to perfection and polished brass lettering that reflected the afternoon sun. Inside, the air smelled of fresh coffee, expensive furniture polish, and scented candles that tried a little too hard to create warmth. Behind the reception desk sat the same woman who had delivered the binder. "Mr. Caldwell," she said with a practiced smile. "I was expecting you." She introduced herself as Victoria Langford, president of the Blackwater Lake Homeowners Association for nearly 15 years. Her office walls displayed community awards, framed newspaper articles, and photographs of neighborhood events stretching back decades. At first glance, she looked less like a neighborhood volunteer and more like the chief executive of a successful corporation. She invited me to sit down, folded her hands neatly across the desk, and spoke with complete confidence. "This community has always depended on cooperation. Previous owners eventually understood that." I slid the binder onto her desk. "I have questions." She barely glanced at it. "Most new owners do." I pointed to the oldest invoice. The original owner listed here died decades ago. Her smile never changed. "Debt survives ownership." I asked for copies of the original governing documents placing my property inside the association. She answered without looking away. Those records are archived. We maintain the official files. It sounded polished, almost rehearsed, but something about the wording bothered me. She never actually said the documents existed. She simply said they maintained the files. Before I left, she handed me another envelope. Inside was a formal notice stating that all exterior renovations, landscaping, dock repairs, and structural improvements required immediate approval from the association before work could begin. Failure to comply would result in additional daily penalties. I stepped back outside carrying yet another stack of paperwork while a gentle breeze carried the clean scent of lake water across the parking lot. As I looked back toward the mansion standing quietly on the opposite shoreline, one thought settled firmly into my mind. Victoria Langford did not behave like someone protecting neighborhood rules. She behaved like someone protecting a story that could not survive too many questions. By the fourth morning, the mansion no longer felt abandoned. It felt surrounded. Every sunrise brought another certified envelope resting against the weathered front door, each one carrying a fresh warning, another deadline, another carefully worded reminder that the Homeowners Association expected immediate compliance. The paper smelled of fresh toner every time I opened one, almost as if they had been printed only moments before arriving at my doorstep. Daily penalties, administrative fees, architectural violations, unauthorized occupancy. It was remarkable how quickly they found new reasons to send invoices before I had even unpacked half my tools. I refused to let frustration make decisions for me. Instead, I began documenting everything. Every letter, every phone call, every date, every signature. My father always carried a small notebook in his shirt pocket because memory fades, but ink does not. I had inherited the same habit. That afternoon, I drove into town hoping to solve one simple problem. I needed temporary electrical service while the house underwent inspection. The utility representative greeted me politely until she entered my property address into her computer. Her expression changed almost immediately. She apologized and explained that my request had been placed on administrative hold because the property was listed under an unresolved ownership review submitted by a third party. She could not tell me who filed it, only that the request had arrived less than 24 hours after my closing. The timing was impossible to ignore. I thanked her, climbed back into my truck, and sat there listening to the ticking sound of the cooling engine. Someone was moving faster than I could react, anticipating every practical step I needed to restore the mansion. By the end of the week, the insurance inspector postponed his visit. A landscaping company canceled without explanation. Even the local dumpster rental company suddenly claimed they had no availability for the next 2 months, although their parking lot was filled with empty containers when I drove past. Their office, Blackwater Lake, looked peaceful from a distance, but beneath that calm surface, invisible currents seemed to pull everything in the same direction. Late Friday afternoon, I decided to walk the property instead of making another phone call. The crisp scent of pine mixed with damp earth as I followed the shoreline toward an old stone boathouse nearly hidden beneath climbing ivy. Fallen branches crunched beneath my boots while gentle waves rolled against the aging dock. The entire estate felt forgotten by time, yet strangely untouched. The farther I walked from the mansion, the quieter everything became. Then I noticed something that had not appeared on any inspection report. Half buried beneath thick weeds stood an old iron survey marker, its weathered top barely visible above the soil. I knelt beside it and brushed away decades of dirt with my gloves. Faint lettering emerged beneath the rust. The numbers did not match the boundary description recorded in my closing documents. I read them twice, then a third time, convinced I had misread the engraving. I had not. A chill moved through me that had nothing to do with the breeze coming off the lake. If that marker was original, then at least one official property line had been recorded differently from what stood in front of me. I slowly stood, looking across the quiet water toward the manicured neighborhood on the opposite shore. For the first time since buying the mansion, I stopped thinking about unpaid invoices. I started wondering whether the real dispute had never been about money at all. The old survey marker stayed on my mind all night. Long after the sun disappeared behind Blackwater Lake, I sat on the dining room floor surrounded by rolled blueprints, inspection reports, and county maps, listening to the steady creak of the mansion settling with the evening air. The smell of aged paper mixed with sawdust and cool lake moisture as I compared measurements under the soft glow of a portable work light. Every line I traced seemed to create another question instead of an answer. The legal description in my deed looked accurate, but the physical marker outside suggested an entirely different boundary had existed long before anyone created the current neighborhood. My father had another saying that echoed through my thoughts. When the land disagrees with the paperwork, keep digging until one of them admits the truth. The next morning I returned to the shoreline carrying nothing more than a shovel, a measuring tape, and my notebook. I followed the bearing stamped into the iron marker exactly as my father had taught me decades earlier. 48 feet north, 72 feet east. Then another angle toward the rear of the estate where thick ivy climbed an old stone retaining wall that looked original to the mansion. As I cleared away years of tangled vines, something unusual caught my attention. One section of the wall sounded hollow when I tapped it with the wooden handle of the shovel. The tone was completely different from the surrounding stone. I brushed away more dirt and discovered faint scrape marks around several blocks, as though someone had intentionally sealed an opening many years ago. After nearly an hour of careful work, one heavy stone shifted just enough for a narrow gap to appear. Cool air drifted out, carrying the unmistakable smell of dry cedar, old paper, and time itself. My flashlight beam disappeared into a small storage room hidden behind the wall. I stepped inside slowly, watching dust swirl through the narrow shaft of sunlight that slipped through the opening behind me. Wooden shelves lined the room from floor to ceiling. Metal filing cabinets stood against the far wall beneath a faded portrait of the mansion taken sometime in the early 1900s. Everything was covered with dust, yet strangely organized. It looked less like forgotten storage and more like someone had deliberately preserved an archive. I opened the nearest cabinet. Inside rested dozens of carefully labeled folders tied with cloth ribbons that had become brittle with age. Survey maps, property tax receipts, construction invoices, personal letters, handwritten maintenance journals dating back generations. Then I noticed an oversized leather portfolio resting by itself on the lowest shelf. Across the front, embossed in fading gold letters, were 5 simple words: Blackwater Lake Original Development Records. My pulse quickened as I carried it to an old workbench in the center of the room. Inside lay beautifully drawn subdivision maps, each signed by licensed surveyors and county officials. They predated every document the Homeowners Association had shown me. I spread the largest map across the bench and immediately recognized the outline of my property. What stopped me cold was everything surrounding it. The neighborhood existed on the map, but the mansion estate sat completely outside the subdivision boundary, separated by a bold survey line that could not be misunderstood. I looked back toward the hidden entrance behind me, realizing that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure these records would survive, waiting patiently for the day someone finally asked the right question. For the next 3 days, I barely left the hidden archive except to sleep a few hours and refill my coffee. The air inside that concealed room carried the dry scent of cedar shelves and aging paper, and every folder I opened seemed to answer one question while creating 2 more. I photographed every document before touching another one, labeling each image with the same method my father had taught me years ago. Dates first, sources second, opinions never. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, a timeline began to emerge across the long workbench. The earliest maps all agreed. My mansion and its surrounding 12 acres had always been classified as an independent lakeside estate. Every subdivision boundary stopped well short of the stone wall hiding this very room. Then everything changed in a folder dated 1974. At first glance, the documents looked ordinary. Meeting minutes, revised neighborhood maps, expansion proposals. But the more closely I compared them with the original survey, the more impossible they became. The boundary line had been redrawn by several hundred feet, quietly absorbing my property into the neighborhood without changing the original deed. Even stranger, the revised map referenced a county approval number that did not appear anywhere else in the archive. I drove to the county records office the following morning carrying only my notebook and photographs. The old courthouse smelled exactly the way every courthouse seems to smell: polished wood, faded carpet, and decades of paper stored inside climate-controlled rooms. A records clerk helped me search the approval number from the 1974 revision. After nearly an hour, she looked up with a puzzled expression. That filing number does not exist. She searched again using different indexes. Nothing. The supposed approval had never been recorded. My heartbeat stayed calm, but inside my mind, every piece suddenly began locking into place. Someone had created a revised subdivision map without completing the legal process required to change the property boundaries. Back at the mansion, I continued comparing tax receipts, maintenance ledgers, and handwritten correspondence from previous owners. One letter stopped me cold. It had been written in 1975 by the estate's former owner to the county assessor. He politely disputed invoices from the Homeowners Association, stating that his property had never been included in the neighborhood and requesting clarification. There was no response attached. Instead, tucked behind the letter sat another invoice demanding payment for community maintenance, complete with late fees already added. The pattern repeated itself year after year. Every new owner questioned the charges. Every file ended with larger balances, additional penalties, and silence. None contained a court order confirming the association's authority. None contained an amended deed. None contained a signed annexation agreement. They simply kept sending bills until people either paid or sold the property. As evenings settled across Blackwater Lake, I carried the original survey map onto the back porch and spread it across an old patio table overlooking the water. Gentle waves reflected the orange glow of the setting sun, while the breeze turned the edges of the paper just enough to remind me how fragile truth can appear after 50 years. Then I noticed one final detail I had overlooked. Every questionable document after 1974 bore the signature of the same family name, Langford. Victoria Langford had not inherited someone else's mistake. She had inherited someone else's secret, and for half a century, her family had been protecting it one invoice at a time. The biggest mistake people make when they uncover something important is believing they have to confront the other side immediately. I had learned long ago that evidence grows stronger when the person hiding the truth keeps believing they are winning. So I stopped arguing. I stopped responding to threatening letters. I stopped correcting false claims. Instead, I quietly built a timeline that no one would be able to ignore. Every morning the mailbox offered another certified envelope, each carrying another demand for payment or another notice about supposed violations. I slipped every document into a plastic sleeve, recorded the delivery time, photographed the envelope, and filed it beside the original records from the hidden archive. Soon an entire wall inside the mansion's library became covered with maps, tax records, meeting minutes, survey photographs, and handwritten notes connected by colored strings. The room smelled of old leather bindings, fresh printer ink, and black coffee that never seemed to stay warm long enough. Piece by piece, 5 decades of paperwork transformed into one continuous story. The original boundary survey. The unexplained revision in 1974. The missing county approval. The identical signatures. The repeated invoices. The unanswered disputes from previous owners. None of it looked dramatic by itself, but together it painted a picture that was impossible to dismiss. I also decided it was time to involve professionals who had no connection to Blackwater Lake. I hired a title attorney from another county, an independent licensed surveyor, and a retired land records examiner who had spent more than 30 years reviewing historic property archives. I never told them my theory. I simply handed each of them copies of the documents and asked one question. Tell me what you see. Their answers arrived separately over the next 10 days, yet every report reached the same conclusion. The mansion had never been legally annexed into the Homeowners Association. The revised boundary map conflicted with recorded deeds. Several supporting documents referenced filings that did not exist. Hearing 3 independent experts reach identical conclusions gave me something far more valuable than confidence. It gave me credibility. Meanwhile, Victoria Langford continued acting exactly as I hoped she would. Another notice arrived announcing additional daily penalties because I had not submitted architectural approval for replacing broken windows. A second letter warned that unauthorized cleanup around the old boathouse violated community preservation standards. Then came an invitation to appear before the Homeowners Association board to discuss my growing financial obligations. I accepted immediately, not because I intended to argue, but because I wanted every future statement to be made voluntarily, on the record, and in front of witnesses. Before the meeting, I installed a long folding table inside the mansion's library and carefully arranged every document into chronological binders. I labeled each section with simple tabs that anyone could follow without legal training. Original surveys, deeds, county records, tax files, correspondence, association notices, expert reports. Looking across those organized binders, I realized the mansion had been waiting decades for someone willing to finish what previous owners had started. The hidden room had preserved the truth. The land had preserved the boundaries. Now all I had to do was give the facts a chance to speak louder than 50 years of carefully repeated assumptions. The Homeowners Association meeting took place on a Thursday evening inside the community clubhouse overlooking the marina. The building smelled of polished wood, fresh coffee, and expensive air freshener, while conversation stopped almost the moment I walked through the front doors carrying a single rolling case behind me. Victoria Langford sat at the center of the board table wearing the same composed smile she had shown me on the day I bought the mansion. Several board members shuffled neatly organized packets in front of them, and a recording secretary adjusted a small microphone. Before announcing that the meeting was now officially in session, Victoria welcomed everyone with polished confidence before turning toward me. "Mr. Caldwell, we appreciate your willingness to resolve this matter." She spoke as though the outcome had already been decided. She summarized the alleged balance, the accumulated assessments, and the additional penalties that had continued growing during the previous weeks. Then she asked the question she clearly expected to end the discussion. "Are you prepared to satisfy your obligations to the association today?" I quietly rolled my case beside the table, opened the latches, and lifted out a thick binder. Then another. Then another. The room gradually fell silent as the stack continued to grow. Original surveys, certified deeds, county tax records, historical plats, expert opinions, archive correspondence. Every binder carried a simple numbered label. I placed the final volume on the table before speaking for the first time. "Before discussing money, I would like us to agree on one thing. We should all be looking at the same history." Victoria's smile barely moved. "The association already has the official records." I nodded politely and opened the first binder. The original subdivision map rested beneath a clear protective sleeve. Next came the county recorder's certification showing the map had never been amended. Then I presented the independent survey completed only days earlier. The licensed surveyor's measurements matched the original boundary almost exactly despite being separated by decades. I turned another page and placed copies of the county search, confirming that the 1974 approval number referenced by the association did not exist in any recorded archive. One board member leaned forward to examine the document more closely. Another removed his glasses and slowly reread the certification. The recording secretary stopped typing altogether. The quiet inside the room became almost louder than conversation. I continued without raising my voice. The next binder contained letters written by previous owners questioning the same assessments stretching back nearly 50 years. None had received legal confirmation that the mansion belonged inside the association. The following binder contained reports prepared independently by a title attorney, a licensed surveyor, and a retired land records examiner. None had communicated with each other before writing their conclusions, yet every report reached the same finding. The estate had never been legally annexed into the Homeowners Association. Finally, I placed the oldest document of them all in the center of the table. It was the original development map recovered from the hidden archive beneath the mansion. Every property line, every measurement, every survey marker matched the physical evidence still standing around Blackwater Lake. The mansion stood completely outside the subdivision boundary. No interpretation was required, only comparison. Victoria reached toward the map, but stopped before touching it. For the first time since we met, she said nothing at all. Around the room, board members slowly looked from one document to another, then toward Victoria, as if realizing that the story they had accepted for years no longer matched the evidence sitting directly in front of them. The meeting ended without a vote. It ended with silence. One by one, the board members gathered copies of the documents from the table, not because I asked them to, but because they suddenly wanted to read every page for themselves. Victoria Langford remained seated, staring at the original survey map as though it had become something entirely different from the paper she had dismissed only minutes earlier. Outside, The evening breeze carried the clean scent of the lake through the open clubhouse doors, replacing the artificial fragrance that had filled the room before I arrived. Less than a week later, I received an official notice from the county requesting the complete collection of historical records I had assembled. The independent reports, the original subdivision maps, the archive correspondence, the certified deeds, and the photographs of the hidden records room were all submitted for review. The county survey office completed its own verification, comparing modern satellite measurements with the original plats recorded decades earlier. Their findings matched every conclusion already sitting inside my binders. My property had never been legally incorporated into the Homeowners Association. Every assessment issued against the estate had been based on a boundary that was never lawfully established. Shortly afterward, another letter arrived at the mansion, but this one felt very different from the first binder Victoria had handed me. Instead of demanding payment, it confirmed that every recorded claim against my property had been withdrawn. The administrative hold affecting utilities and restoration permits was removed. The county also confirmed that future governance of the mansion would remain entirely independent from the association. As additional historical records were reviewed, several former property owners contacted me after hearing what had been discovered. Some still had faded receipts showing payments they had made years earlier simply to avoid arguments they believed they could never win. Others shared letters almost identical to the ones preserved inside the hidden archive. Together, those documents told a story far larger than one forgotten mansion. They revealed how assumptions, repeated often enough, can slowly begin to resemble facts until someone is willing to compare them against the original record. Throughout the following months, the mansion gradually came back to life. Broken windows reflected the morning sun once again. The old dock was carefully restored using the original design preserved in the archive. Fresh cedar replaced weathered boards, and the sound of hammers echoed across Blackwater Lake for the first time in years without a single interruption. Every improvement honored the history that had nearly disappeared beneath decades of confusion. Sometimes I still walk down to the stone wall where the hidden room waited quietly for so many years. The shelves are cleaner now, the maps properly preserved, and the old survey marker still stands exactly where my father would have expected it to stand. It never moved. Only the story built around it did. I often think back to the moment Victoria placed that thick binder into my hands on my first day at the mansion. She believed she was delivering 50 years of debt. Instead, she handed me the first piece of evidence that unraveled 50 years of mistaken authority. My father was right all along. Land never lies. Paper never forgets. And when the truth is patient enough, justice does not have to raise its voice. It simply waits for someone willing to read every page.